Molly Pritchard stood alone in the center of the town square, her head lowered, hands rough from years of hard labor. The sun beat down on her as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the shame creep up her neck. It was 1879, during the harsh drought season in Wyoming Territory, and the hiring fair had begun. The men of the town stood in groups, talking among themselves and casting glances at the line of widows. The air was thick with anticipation that felt more like judgment to Molly. She was one of the last women remaining, standing at the edge of the crowd. The other women were younger, lighter, their clothes cleaner and more fashionable. Molly was heavy, plain, with streaks of dirt under her nails and a face weathered from years of toil. Her husband had passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind nothing but gambling debts that she had worked tirelessly to pay off. Now, here she was, alone, without a home, and at the mercy of the men who would decide her fate today. As the minutes passed, one by one, the women were selected by the ranchers. The youngest, the prettiest, the ones with the finest clothes were chosen first. The whispers began, soft but sharp. "Who'd take her on?" someone muttered. "Poor thing," another said, almost with pity. Molly's chin quivered as she heard the words, but she held her ground. She wasn't here for pity. She was here to work. When the last woman was chosen, only Molly remained. Her face flushed with the humiliation of being the last one standing, but her pride refused to let her bow her head. This wasn't the end. It was just another moment where she had to prove herself. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, her voice strong as she spoke to the group. "No one wants me, but I can work," she declared. Her words cut through the air, clear and without hesitation. There was no self-pity in her voice, just truth. "I can cook for 20, butcher, clean, wash clothes, preserve meat, and more. I don't need your sympathy. I need work." Her eyes scanned the group of men, daring them to judge her. "I'm not here to beg. I'm here to do what I know how to do." The town fell silent. The men shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. They hadn't expected this from her, not a woman like her. But Molly was steady. She had worked too long to let their opinions matter. She wasn't asking for a second chance. She was demanding one. Then, through the silence, a voice broke in. "I'll hire you." Molly turned sharply to find a speaker, a man in his mid-40s, weathered and worn, standing tall among the others. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and his eyes had the look of someone who had seen more than his fair share of hardship. He was a rancher, Jack Dawson. His gaze was steady and unfazed, as if he had already made up his mind before she spoke. The others in the square looked at him in surprise, some with disapproval, others with curiosity. "I need someone who won't quit when things get tough," Jack continued. His voice was low but firm. "I don't care what you look like, Molly Pritchard. I care that you can do the work. And I need help." Molly stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She had not expected this. She had prepared herself for rejection once again. But Jack Dawson's words, his acceptance, stirred something deep inside her. Could it be that someone saw her worth after all? She glanced around, still feeling the weight of the town's judgment. The whispers were still there, following her every move like a dark cloud. But Jack was different. He wasn't looking at her with pity or scorn. He was looking at her as a person who could help, someone who could stand by him and make a difference. "Why me?" Molly asked, her voice shaking just a little. "There are younger, prettier women here. Why choose me?" Jack met her gaze without flinching. "You're the only one who stood tall when everyone else cowered. That's why. I don't need someone who'll just sit around and wait for things to get easier. I need someone who knows how to survive, who understands what hard work really is." Molly felt the truth of his words, the sincerity in them. She had spent so long believing that no one would want her because of how she looked, but here was a man who saw beyond that. He wasn't offering her kindness out of pity. He was offering her a chance to prove herself. "I'll take it," she said, her voice steady now. "But I want you to know, this isn't some charity. I'll work for you. but it's work, not a favor. Jack nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. And so, the agreement was made. The town watched as they exchanged words, a final seal on the deal. No one spoke as Molly climbed into the wagon beside Jack, and the two of them set off toward the ranch. The silence was deafening, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her once more. But as the wagon rolled forward, Molly felt something stirring within her, an unfamiliar feeling of hope. Had she made the right decision? She didn't know yet. But as the wheels creaked beneath her and Jack's quiet presence filled the space beside her, she realized she didn't have to know everything. She just had to move forward. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better than she ever imagined. As the wagon rolled toward the ranch, Molly gripped the wooden seat. She'd agreed to work for a stranger, live on his land, alone. The town's whispers followed like dust behind the wheels. She glanced at the silent cowboy beside her. Had she just made the best decision of her life? Or the most foolish? Molly Pritchard's heart raced as the wagon jolted over the uneven terrain, the journey stretching on for what seemed like hours. The silence between her and Jack felt heavy, but there was something oddly comforting about it. She had left behind the judgment of the town, but in its place was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The landscape was vast and wild, a stark contrast to the crowded town square she had just escaped. The ranch came into view, a modest cabin, a weathered barn, and a small, overgrown garden. It wasn't much, but it was a place where Molly could start over. When they arrived, Jack led her to a small, clean room with a lock on the door, offering her a sense of privacy she hadn't had in months. She was grateful for the quiet, the space to breathe, but soon Jack handed her a challenge. "Can you make supper with what we have?" he asked, gesturing to the meager supplies in the kitchen. Molly smiled, confident despite the challenge. "I can make supper for 10 with this," she replied. Jack gave her a surprised look, his first genuine smile since they had met. That night, she prepared a simple but delicious meal, and when Jack sat down to eat, he couldn't help but voice his surprise. "Haven't eaten like this in years," he said, his voice soft with appreciation. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the skill and care she put into it. Over the next few days, Molly settled into a routine. She tackled the laundry mountain, repaired Jack's torn shirts, and organized the pantry. Her hands ached from the physical toll of unfamiliar labor, but she pushed through it, never once complaining. Jack noticed the way she winced when she moved, the way her body betrayed her, but he didn't say anything. He simply left liniment by her door each night. It was a quiet gesture, but it spoke volumes. In the first week, Molly had already earned Jack's respect, not through words, but through her hard work and determination. One afternoon, a ranch hand named Curtis came by to discuss cattle logistics. Molly overheard him make a crude remark about her, about Jack's tastes, and she was surprised when Jack immediately fired him. "Get off my land," Jack said, his voice cold and unwavering. Molly felt a strange mix of relief and gratitude. She had never been defended like that before, not by anyone, let alone a man. As the days passed, Jack continued to trust her with more responsibilities. One afternoon, Jack brought in a slaughtered hog for butchering. It was a job Molly was well versed in, and together they worked side by side for 3 days, preparing the meat for the upcoming cattle drive. There was an ease between them now, a rhythm that wasn't forced. They laughed together as they worked, and in the quiet moments, there was a tension that neither of them acknowledged. Jack had his own way of showing kindness, whether it was offering to rub her sore back after a long day or the quiet, respectful touch of his hand. Molly couldn't deny the attraction that was building between them, but she pushed it aside. She had work to do. She had come here to survive, not to find romance. That night, as she lay in her bed, her mind wandered back to the evening's exchange. Jack's careful touch lingered in her mind, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something more. But then, she reminded herself this was just work, nothing more. So, why did her heart race when she thought of him? That night, Molly lay in her small room, still feeling the ghost of his hands on her shoulders. It had been professional, nothing more. So why was her heart racing? And why, when she closed her eyes, did she see his face? This was work, only work, wasn't it? 3 weeks had passed since Molly Pritchard arrived at the Dawson Ranch. And in those few short weeks, she had come to realize that she had found something she never thought possible: a sense of purpose. The hard work, the routine, the quiet respect Jack had shown her all combined to make her feel like she had a place again in the world. But everything she had built, everything she had fought for, was about to be tested. Jack decided it was time to go into town for supplies. The thought of facing the town again made Molly's stomach twist. She had left that life behind, or so she thought. Now, it was coming back to her, and with it, the judgment and harsh whispers she had tried to escape. "You need new work clothes, Molly," Jack had said, his voice calm, though he could see the hesitation in her eyes. "You need to be properly dressed for the work ahead." But it wasn't the clothes Molly was worried about. It was the eyes of the town, the whispers that would follow her wherever she went. Jack's reassuring presence beside her was the only thing that kept her from retreating into herself. Still, as the wagon rolled toward town, she couldn't shake the anxiety. She had hoped to fade into the background, to remain unseen. Instead, she was walking back into the judgment that had made her feel less than human for so long. As they entered the town, Molly's eyes scanned the familiar streets. The general store stood ahead, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. The air felt thick with tension as they pulled the wagon to a stop. The women in town went silent the moment they saw her, their gazes shifting uneasily toward Jack and then to Molly. She felt the weight of their judgment before a single word was spoken. The storekeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted them with a forced politeness, his eyes darting between Molly and Jack. The air was thick with the unspoken questions. What was a respectable man like Jack Dawson doing with a woman like her? She was a widow, heavy-set, and had no place in this town. But Jack didn't seem to notice or care about their stares. He led her into the store, his step sure, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The moment they entered, Molly could feel the eyes on her, scrutinizing, judging. And then Mrs. Brennan, the town gossip, broke the silence with a loud voice that echoed through the room. Well, Mrs. Brennan's voice was dripping with sarcasm. "A lady like you with a man like Jack Dawson? I wouldn't call it proper." She glanced at Molly with a sneer. "A woman with your figure has no business being alone with a man. Not unless you've made arrangements. No respectable woman would live alone with a man." The other women in the store exchanged uncomfortable glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking away, unwilling to get involved. But the implication was clear. Molly was nothing more than Jack's mistress, a woman who had somehow traded her dignity for a roof over her head. The whispers started, quiet first, then growing louder. Molly felt the heat of their judgment flush her cheeks. She wanted to disappear, to run back to the ranch and hide. But she stood still, her head held high, refusing to let them see how much their words stung. "I'll just be getting a few things," she said, her voice steady despite the tumult in her chest. She didn't even glance at the fabric that Jack had suggested. He had asked for better fabric, but she was beyond such gestures. She was here to prove she didn't need to be coddled. She selected only the practical items: flour, sugar, a few bolts of work cloth for a next set of dresses. Jack stood beside her, his presence a silent shield against the venomous stares. Mrs. Brennan wasn't done, though. She continued her cruel remarks, making jabs at Molly's appearance, her weight, and even her usefulness in the kitchen. "At least she's useful in the kitchen," Mrs. Brennan sneered, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. Molly kept her gaze focused on the fabric she was selecting, her fingers trembling as she folded it into a neat bundle. She could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her, but she refused to look at them. She refused to let them break her. "You're wrong about me," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here to work. Nothing else." Jack's voice cut through the tension like a knife. His patience, which had been calm up until now, snapped. "Mrs. Pritchard is my employee," he said, his voice low but clear. "She's the best ranch manager I've had. If it weren't for her, my ranch would have crumbled." His words struck a blow to the silence, and the store seemed to hold its breath. He turned to the storekeeper, his expression hardening. "3 cuts of that blue fabric. The best you have." The store went completely still. Jack Dawson wasn't a man who demanded things. But when it came to Molly, he was unwavering. The storekeeper didn't say a word, but nodded quickly and moved to get the fabric. Jack's hand rested gently on Molly's back, a protective gesture, but one that was felt by everyone in the room. The message was clear. Jack wasn't ashamed of her. Jack didn't care what the town thought, and neither should she. As they left the store, the stares didn't stop, but the tension in the air had shifted. Jack's defense of her had silenced the women, at least for now. Molly felt a strange sense of relief, but also a heavy weight pressing on her chest. She had thought leaving the town meant leaving their judgment behind. But as she climbed back into the wagon, she realized the truth. The town's opinion would never change. What mattered was what she believed about herself. "You didn't have to do that," Molly said quietly as Jack took the reins. "They've been whispering about me for years. I'm used to it." Jack's jaw tightened, his gaze focused on the road ahead. "People judge what they don't understand," he said, "but I won't let them make you feel small. Not while I'm here." Molly felt her heart swell with emotion, but she fought to keep her composure. "Why did you really choose me, Jack?" she asked, her voice soft. Jack glanced at her, his eyes steady. "Because you're the only one who didn't cower. You stood tall when the others just looked down. I needed that strength." She swallowed hard, the words settling deep inside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt like maybe she wasn't invisible after all. As the ranch came into view, Molly wiped away the tears she hadn't even realized were falling. Jack's words echoed in her mind. "The strongest person I know." She looked at him, at the man who had defended her, and something inside her shifted. This wasn't just gratitude anymore. This was something else, something deeper, and she had no idea what to do with it. 2 days had passed since their trip to town, and the storm had rolled in as quietly as the tension between them. The winds had begun to howl in the distance by evening, but it wasn't until the middle of the night that the storm truly arrived. Molly woke to the sound of rain tapping furiously on the roof, followed by the unmistakable drip-drip of water. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor, only to find that the roof had sprung a leak directly over her bed. Water poured through the rafters, soaking everything in its path. She cursed under her breath as she tried to move her few belongings out of the way. Her mattress was soaked, and her meager possessions were drenched. In that moment, everything felt hopeless. She wasn't sure what was worse, the storm that had come out of nowhere or the realization that, despite everything she had done, she still had no place to call her own. It wasn't long before Jack appeared at the door, his face drawn with concern. Without a word, he helped her carry her belongings into the main room, his hands steady and sure. "You'll take my bed tonight," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos outside. "I'll sleep on the floor." Molly opened her mouth to protest, but Jack raised a hand to stop her. "Not in my house," he said, his tone firm. There was no arguing with him when he spoke like that. The storm raged on outside, its fury matching the storm of emotions brewing inside Molly. She hesitated for only a moment before accepting his offer. She had no other choice. She took his bed, though it felt strange to be in the larger, softer space without him. Jack moved to the floor by the fire, keeping his distance. They both lay awake, the noise of the storm deafening as they stared into the darkness, unable to sleep. The night felt long, each minute stretching into what seemed like eternity. Finally, Jack broke the silence, his voice low and quiet. "I'm not used to having someone else around," he said, almost to himself. Molly turned her head, surprised by his vulnerability. She could barely make out his features in the dim light, but she could sense the weight of his words. "Neither am I," she replied softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke again, each lost in their thoughts as the storm outside howled louder. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when the storm seemed to calm just a little, that the silence between them broke. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and Molly gasped, startled. Jack was instantly beside her, his hand on her arm. She felt the warmth of his touch through the fabric of her nightgown. And for a moment, she thought she might have imagined the way his body had instinctively moved toward hers. His hand lingered just for a moment before he pulled it away. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice gruff. Molly looked up at him, her heart racing. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her body betrayed her, the proximity to him setting her pulse racing in a way she couldn't explain. There was a quiet tension between them now, something unspoken that hung in the air like the storm's aftermath. Molly couldn't help but wonder if Jack had felt the same shift she had. She quickly pushed the thought aside. This was work. This was survival. Nothing more. And yet, the connection she felt with him was undeniable. The storm continued to rage through the night, but in that small, dark room, the air between them seemed to quiet. The sounds of the world outside, the winds and the rain, faded into the background as she became acutely aware of Jack's presence beside her. Neither of them spoke again. They simply existed in the space, the silence between them filled with all the things they couldn't say. By dawn, the storm had passed. The first light of morning crept through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. The air was still thick with the weight of the night's events, but there was work to be done. Molly felt an unspoken understanding between her and Jack, a silent agreement that the storm, though violent, had passed, leaving a new reality in its wake. They rose early, both moving quietly through the house, assessing the damage. The roof would need repairs, but that could wait. Jack had more immediate concerns. He turned to Molly, a quiet determination in his eyes. "We'll fix it," he said, his voice steady. But there was a new tension in his words, a hint of something more. Molly nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her. "I can help," she offered, though the idea of climbing on a roof made her stomach tighten. Jack glanced at her, as if weighing her words, and then nodded. "You'll be holding the tar paper," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They gathered the necessary tools and made their way to the roof, where Molly had to fight the nervousness that tightened her chest. Heights had always made her uneasy, but this was different. This wasn't a job she could shy away from. Jack moved beside her, steady and sure, his presence grounding her as she struggled to steady her hands. He noticed her discomfort, and without a word, he reached out to steady her, his hand on her back for just a moment. The contact was brief, but it sent a ripple of awareness through her. She forced herself to focus, her hands gripping the tar paper, ignoring the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "It's not so bad up here, is it?" Jack asked, his voice low as he worked beside her. She glanced at him, feeling the connection between them grow. "It's different," she said softly. "You can see everything." Jack gave her a sideways glance. "Yeah, like you can see possibility." Molly's heart stilled for a moment as she absorbed his words. "I haven't looked for possibility in years," she said quietly. Jack turned his full attention to her now, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe it's time you started," he said, the weight of his words sinking into her. Molly held his gaze for a long moment, her mind racing. This was more than just a job. This was something else entirely, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. And then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. The roof was repaired, the damage assessed, and Jack was already moving on to the next task. But Molly couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something deep and undeniable. As the day wore on, Jack's brother Samuel arrived, bringing with him a wave of tension that Molly hadn't expected. The younger Dawson brother was handsome and charming, everything Jack wasn't. He looked at Molly with barely concealed disapproval, and his judgment was clear in every word he spoke. "This is who you've got managing things, Jack?" Samuel asked, his voice laced with a thinly veiled sneer. Jack's response was sharp, his voice low and cold. "Careful, Sam," he warned, his eyes narrowing. Samuel didn't back down, his gaze lingering on Molly with unspoken judgment. She could feel it, the scrutiny in his eyes, the way he sized her up as if she were something less than she was. The tension at the dinner table that night was palpable, and Molly couldn't help but feel small beneath Samuel's gaze. She excused herself early, retreating to her room, her heart heavy with the weight of the unspoken judgment that hung over her. She wasn't sure what to make of it. She wasn't sure what it meant for her and Jack. But when the argument between the brothers spilled out into the night, Molly knew that something was about to change. Molly lay in her room, listening to the brothers' argument through the walls. Samuel's voice was sharp as he criticized her place in the ranch, while Jack's voice was barely audible, defensive yet resigned. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. In the morning, everything would change. She could feel it in her bones. What would Jack choose? And what would that choice mean for her? Molly woke early the next morning, the faint light of dawn creeping through the cracks of the cabin. The previous night's tension still hung in the air, as thick as the silence between her and Jack. She had barely slept, her mind racing with the weight of everything that had happened. Jack's brother, Samuel, had come and gone, leaving behind a trail of judgment that Molly couldn't ignore. His words had cut deeper than she cared to admit, even though she tried to convince herself it didn't matter. She wasn't here to be accepted by Jack's family. She was here to work, to rebuild her life on her own terms. Still, the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. As she made her way to the barn with a basket of breakfast for Jack, she overheard voices, low, heated voices. It didn't take long for her to recognize them as Jack and Samuel's. She stopped in her tracks, hiding behind a stack of hay bales, straining to hear. Samuel's voice was sharp, his words full of disdain. "You're making a mistake, Jack," he said. "She's not the woman you need. She doesn't fit in here. What would people say?" Molly's heart sank. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the coldness in Samuel's tone or the hesitation she could hear in Jack's response. "She's good at what she does," Jack said, his voice quieter now, as if trying to defend himself. "She's the only one who's made this ranch work. I'm not worried about what other people think." Samuel scoffed. "You should be. You're thinking with your heart, not your head. What's going to happen when she doesn't fit in with the rest of the world? What will the ranchers think when they find out you've got a woman like that working for you?" Molly felt the sting of Samuel's words deep in her chest. She had known from the start that she didn't belong in this world. She had never been the type of woman to fit the mold of society's expectations. Too plain, too heavy, too much. But hearing Jack's brother voice those same fears made her feel as if her worst fears had been confirmed. Jack didn't speak for a long moment, and when he did, his voice was a quiet growl. "She's earned her place here. I won't let anyone, including you, make her feel less than she is." Molly's breath caught her throat. There was the Jack she had come to know, the man who had defended her when no one else had, the man who saw something in her that no one else did. Her heart raced at his words, but they were also the hardest to hear. She had known from the beginning that this was a temporary arrangement. She had come here to survive, to escape the crushing weight of judgment and failure. She hadn't expected anything more. But now, with his words hanging in the air, the truth hit her like a slap in the face. She wasn't just his employee anymore. She was something more, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. She turned and walked away from the barn, her hands trembling as she placed the basket of breakfast on the porch. The last thing she wanted was to overhear more of their conversation. She needed space, time to think, to sort through the feelings that had begun to swirl inside her. As she stood on the porch, Staring out at the land she had worked so hard to help rebuild, she felt the weight of everything settle onto her shoulders. She had always been the one who had to keep moving, who had to keep working. She had never let herself stop long enough to feel anything, to acknowledge the loneliness that had crept into her heart over the years. But now it felt different. Everything about this place, about Jack, felt different. She didn't want to be the one to run, to hide from her feelings, but she didn't know how to stay either. The sound of Jack's boots on the porch steps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him standing there, his face drawn with concern. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to figure out what was going on inside her. "Molly," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat tightened as she stared at him, trying to find the right thing to say. Instead, she shook her head. "I heard you talking to Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what you really think." Jack's expression faltered, and for a brief moment, she saw the doubt in his eyes. "Molly," he began, but she cut him off. "I know what he said," she repeated, her voice stronger now, though still laced with hurt. "I heard him, and I know it's true." Jack took a step closer, his hand reaching out toward her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I'm not what you wanted, Jack," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'm not the woman you need. I'm not the one you should be choosing." "That's not true," Jack said fiercely, his voice full of conviction. "Molly, listen to me. You're more than anything I ever expected, more than anything I could have asked for. I chose you because you're strong, because you're capable, because you're the best damn thing that's happened to this ranch. And I don't care what anyone else thinks, especially Samuel." Molly's heart pounded in her chest, but the wall she had built around herself was still standing firm. "I'm not what you think," she said softly, her gaze falling to the ground. "You don't really see me, Jack. Not all of me." His hand gently cupped her chin, lifting her face to meet his. "Then let me see you," he said, his voice low, full of sincerity. "Let me see all of you, Molly, because I don't want anyone else. I don't want anyone but you." Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But she couldn't shake the fear that in time, he would see her for what she truly was and turn away. "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that I'm enough. I'm too much, too broken. You're better off without me." Jack's expression softened, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. "You're not broken, Molly," he murmured into her hair. "And you're more than enough. You've always been enough." For the first time in months, Molly let herself relax into his embrace. She closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of him, of the ranch, of hard work, of something that felt like home. But as the moment stretched on, she knew what she had to do. She pulled away, stepping back from him, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. "I need time," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to figure out what I want. What this is. What you mean to me." Jack nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "I'm not going anywhere, Molly," he said softly. "Take all the time you need. I'm not leaving. I'll wait for you." The promise in his voice both comforted and terrified her. As he turned to leave for the cattle drive, she knew that her life was about to change. And in 6 weeks, when he returned, she would have to decide if she was ready to take that step, if she was ready to love him truly and completely. Jack gave her one last look as he climbed onto his horse, his eyes full of hope, full of something more. Molly stood there, watching him ride away, her heart torn between the fear of losing herself and the hope of finding a love she never thought possible. When he returned, would she be ready? And if she wasn't, would she lose him forever? 6 weeks had passed since Jack left for the cattle drive, and in that time, Molly had transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The ranch was thriving, perhaps more so than it ever had before. Jack's absence had given her the space to truly take charge. to make decisions that shaped the future of the place. Every morning, she woke with the same quiet determination that Jack had admired in her since the day they first met. She had taken ownership of the ranch in a way that made her proud, organizing tasks, managing the ranch's finances, and keeping everything running smoothly. But there were moments, fleeting and brief, when the emptiness of Jack's absence settled in. She had filled the space with work, with purpose, but the ache of not having him there was undeniable. Each time she passed his empty room, each time she sat at the kitchen table alone, the loneliness crept in. She missed him in ways she hadn't realized she would. Yet, in these 6 weeks, she had learned something important about herself. She didn't need Jack to define her. She had proven to herself that she could run this ranch, that she could survive on her own. She had come to love this land, the feel of the earth beneath her feet, the smell of the animals, and the steady rhythm of the work. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, building, thriving. The morning Jack's riders appeared on the horizon, Molly stood on the porch of the cabin, waiting for them. She wore a new blue dress she had made herself, and her hair was loose, flowing in the breeze. She felt different, stronger, more confident, more herself than she had ever been. As the riders drew closer, she saw Jack at the front of the group, his familiar face making her heart skip a beat. The cattle drive had been successful, just as Jack had promised, and the ranch was saved. But it wasn't just the success of the drive that made her heart race. It was seeing Jack again, the man who had become so much more than just her employer, the man who had seen her, truly seen her, and believed in her when no one else had. When a wagon finally pulled up to the ranch, Jack dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning the landscape before they settled on Molly. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, staring at her, as though seeing her for the first time. She could see the shock in his eyes, but it wasn't the shock of seeing her standing there. It was the shock of seeing how far she had come, how much she had changed in his absence. He took a few steps toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. "You look," he started, his voice catching for a moment. "Different," he finished, his eyes softening with something more than admiration. Molly smiled, her heart swelling with the recognition in his eyes. "I had time to think," she said quietly, "about what I wanted, about who I wanted to be." Jack stepped closer, his eyes scanning her with a new appreciation. He looked around at the ranch, his gaze landing on the improvements she had made, the repairs to the barn, the better management of the land, the thriving garden. He raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "You didn't just maintain it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You've improved it." Molly's smile widened. "I had time," she repeated, "and I've learned to stop waiting for someone else to make things happen." Jack's face softened, a look of admiration on his face as he took her hand gently. "I should have known," he said, his voice low. "I should have known you could do this." Molly squeezed his hand, her heart fluttering in her chest. "You didn't believe in me, Jack." "Not at first." He looked at her, his expression serious. "You were right. I didn't believe in you the way I should have. But now I know." Molly felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I didn't need you to believe in me," she said softly. "I needed to believe in myself." Jack stepped closer, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch tender. "You've always had the strength, Molly. You just needed the chance to see it." They stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant calls of the cattle filling the space between them. It was as if the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of them standing in the quiet understanding they had built over the past months. For the first time in ages, Molly felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wasn't just the woman who had come to the ranch to work. She was a woman who had built something real, something important. And Jack, the man who had believed in her when no one else had, was standing beside her. "Come on," she said softly, taking his hand and leading him inside the cabin. "I made dinner." Jack followed her, but his eyes never left hers. "I've missed this," he said quietly. "Missed you." Molly's heart swelled at his words. but she pushed the feelings aside. This wasn't just about their connection anymore. This was about something bigger, something more lasting. She had learned to live for herself, to make her own decisions, to define her own worth. She didn't need Jack to fill the emptiness in her heart, but that didn't mean she didn't want him in her life. That didn't mean she didn't want to share this life with him. As they sat down at the table for dinner, the conversation flowed easily between them, the comfortable silences filled with shared understanding. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the life they were building together. And Molly felt the weight of all her fears and doubts begin to lift, replaced by something brighter, something more hopeful. As the evening wore on, Jack stood up and moved to the window, his eyes scanning the land. "You've done something incredible here, Molly," he said quietly. "You've rebuilt this place. And more than that, you've rebuilt yourself. I can see it." She walked over to him, standing beside him as they looked out over the ranch. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. Jack turned to her, his expression softening. "You could have. You've always had it in you. But I'm glad I was here to see it." The moment felt almost too perfect, as though the years of hardship and uncertainty had led to this single, beautiful instant. They were standing together, side by side, as equals. And in that moment, Molly realized that Jack hadn't just come back from the cattle drive. He had come back for her. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need to know something. When you left, what did you really mean when you said you'd wait for me?" He turned to face her, his eyes full of the sincerity that had always drawn her in. "I meant that I would wait as long as it took. Because I knew, deep down, that you were the one I was meant to be with. Not because I needed you to complete me, but because you're the person I want to share this life with." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. "And I want that too," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Not because I need you to fix me, but because I choose you." Jack's hand reached for hers, his fingers gently brushing against hers. "Then let's build something together," he said, his voice filled with warmth and hope. "Let's build this life, this ranch, this future together." Molly's heart swelled with the promise of something more than she had ever dared hope for. This was the beginning of everything she had ever wanted, of a love built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a future she was finally ready to embrace. As they stood there, hand in hand, the sun setting behind them, Molly knew that this was just the beginning of their story. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it, ready to face whatever came next. Together. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the ranch as Jack and Molly stood side by side, their hands intertwined. The promise of a new beginning stretched out before them. But deep inside, Molly couldn't help but wonder, could love, true love, really be built on the foundation of hard work, respect, and mutual understanding? Only time would tell, and she was ready to find out.